Think you could survive on what Americans ate during the Revolutionary War? Think again. Forget every romantic notion you've ever had about colonial life. The cozy kitchens, the hearty meals, the simple pleasures of farm-to-table eating. We're about to drop you into a world where a single bad harvest means starvation, where your morning coffee might be made from burnt grain and tree bark, and where the difference between independence and death often came down to whether you could stretch a bag of moldy flour for one more week. Welcome to revolutionary America, where freedom wasn't just political. It was the freedom to eat tomorrow. 1. Welcome to your colonial kitchen. Congratulations! You just woken up in the year 1775, and you're about to discover that everything you thought you knew about good old-fashioned cooking was a complete lie. Your eyes open to a world where the grocery store is a fantasy, refrigeration is science fiction, and your survival depends entirely on your ability to coax food from an environment that's actively trying to kill you. The romantic colonial kitchen you've seen in movies? Forget it. Your reality is a smoke-filled room dominated by a massive stone fireplace that's equal parts cooking apparatus and death trap. Let's start with your kitchen, shall we? It's not a kitchen at all. It's a battlefield. The centerpiece is a fireplace, so large you could literally walk into it, assuming you don't mind being roasted alive. There's no cute little gas range with perfectly controllable burners. Instead, you've got a gaping maw of stone and mortar that devours with like a hungry beast and belches smoke that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. Hanging from iron cranes are massive cast iron pots, some weighing more than your modern microwave when empty. These aren't quaint cooking vessels. They're industrial equipment operated by people who've developed biceps like blacksmiths just from lifting them. The heat from your fire is so intense that you can't get within 3 feet of it without feeling like you're being slowly baked from the outside in. Your cooking utensils would look like torture devices to modern eyes. Long-handled spoons stretching 3 feet, designed so you can stir without losing your eyebrows. Flesh forks that look more suitable for hay than food. And everywhere, the constant smell of wood smoke mixed with whatever grease has been accumulating in your pots for the past month. Because yes, you don't wash these things the way you wash dishes today. The floor beneath your feet isn't tile or linoleum. It's packed dirt, maybe wooden planks if you're lucky. Every surface is coated with a fine layer of ash and grease that never quite comes clean. Your countertops are rough wooden planks, scarred from years of chopping, slicing, and the occasional accident with a cleaver. But here's where it gets really interesting. You don't just cook in this room, you live in it. During winter, the kitchen fireplace provides the only heat for your entire house. So while you're trying to prepare meals, you're also drying clothes, warming babies, and melting ice for drinking water. It's like trying to run a restaurant inside a sauna while also doing laundry and babysitting. Your pantry is whatever you managed to preserve from last year's harvest, stored in a root cellar that's basically a hole in the ground lined with stones. Down there in the cold, damp darkness, you've got barrels of salted pork floating in brine, dried corn hanging in braids, and vegetables buried in sand, all hoping to last until the next growing season. The sensory assault is overwhelming. Wood smoke burns your nostrils constantly. The sizzle and pop of fat hitting hot iron fills your ears. Your hands are permanently stained with grease and dirt that no amount of lye soap can completely remove. And the smells? Oh, the smells. Rancid fat with smoke, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present aroma of whatever's been simmering in that pot for the past 3 days. You wake up every morning knowing that every calorie counts. There's no running to the corner store if you run out of milk. No calling for pizza if you don't feel like cooking. No refrigerator humming in the corner, preserving your food with the miracle of modern technology. Your relationship with food is immediate, visceral, and tinged with the constant fear that there might not be enough. Your daily routine revolves entirely around food procurement, preparation, and preservation. Before dawn, you're feeding the fire that died down overnight. By sunrise, you're milking cows, collecting eggs, and planning what you can possibly create from whatever ingredients manage to survive the night without spoiling. Every meal is an act of faith. Will the bread rise? Will the milk still be good? Did the mice get into the grain barrel again? Each bite represents hours of labor, careful planning, and a little prayer to whatever deity watches over colonial kitchens. And that's on a normal day. Wait until the war starts, and British soldiers begin marching through your fields, requisitioning your livestock and grain. Wait until blockades cut off the sugar and salt you depend on for preservation. Wait until your neighbors start hoarding food and prices skyrocket beyond anything you can afford. But right now, in this moment of 1775, you're still living in the before times. You still believe that if you work hard enough, plan carefully enough, and preserve wisely enough, you can keep your family fed. You haven't yet learned that war doesn't just kill soldiers, it starves civilians. You haven't yet discovered what happens when a Continental Army marches through your farm and takes every piece of livestock you own for the cause. You haven't yet experienced the panic of realizing that your preservation salt is gone, your sugar is gone, and winter is coming whether you're ready or not. So take a moment. Look around your smoke-filled, grease-stained, perpetually dangerous kitchen. Appreciate the fact that you still have food to cook, wood to burn, and the luxury of complaining about how hard your life is. Because everything is about to change. The shot heard round the world is about to echo across your dinner table. And when it does, you're going to learn that the real revolution wasn't just political. It was figuring out how to eat. 2. Dawn's first hunger, your colonial breakfast. But first, you need to survive this morning. And in colonial America, even breakfast is trying to kill you. The rooster's crow pierces the pre-dawn darkness, but you're already awake. You've been lying there for the past hour, listening to your stomach growl and dreading the moment you'll have to leave your pile of scratchy wool blankets and face the dying embers of last night's fire. There's no snooze button in 1775, no lazy Sunday mornings, and definitely no breakfast in bed unless you want to eat ash-flavored porridge while wrapped in smoke. You stumble to the fireplace in the gray half-light, your bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor like ice picks to your soul. The fire that seemed so robust last night is now a pathetic collection of glowing coals, barely enough to warm your hands, let alone cook anything edible. Welcome to your first daily crisis, rebuilding civilization, one flame at a time. Feeding the fire isn't just striking a match. It's an art form that determines whether your family eats or starves today. You carefully arrange kindling, blow on those precious coals until your lungs burn, and pray that the wood catches before the last ember dies. Too much air and you'll scatter the coals. Too little and you'll smother what heat remains. Get it wrong, and you're eating raw cornmeal for breakfast, if you're lucky. Once you've coaxed your fire back to life, it's time to face the morning meal. And here's where every romantic notion about hearty colonial breakfasts goes to die a brutal death. Forget fluffy pancakes with maple syrup. Forget eggs Benedict or avocado toast. Your breakfast options are cornmeal mush, leftover meat from yesterday, if it hasn't spoiled, a hunk of bread that could double as a weapon, and whatever alcoholic beverage is safer than the water. That's it. That's the menu. Every single day. Let's start with the cornmeal mush, or hasty pudding, as you optimistically call it. You dump coarse cornmeal into a pot of water or milk, assuming the cow cooperated this morning and the milk hasn't soured overnight. The mixture bubbles and spits like an angry volcano, requiring constant stirring with your 3-foot wooden spoon while dodging spatters that could leave permanent scars. The texture is challenging. Think wet cement with attitude. The flavor is equally inspiring. Imagine eating library paste with a faint corn aftertaste. But it's hot, it fills your stomach, and it won't actively poison you, which makes it a breakfast victory by 1775 standards. If you're feeling fancy, you might sweeten it with molasses or maple syrup, assuming you can afford such luxuries. More likely, you're eating it plain and pretending it tastes better than it does. Your children learn early not to complain about food, partly from good manners and partly because complaining doesn't magically create better options. Next comes the bread situation. Your loaf isn't the soft, pillowy creation modern people call bread. This is a dense, dark brick made from whatever grain you could afford, usually rye or barley mixed with corn. It's been sitting out for days, slowly achieving the consistency of aged leather. You don't slice this bread. You attack it with a knife and hope for the best. The crust could deflect musket balls. The interior is so dense you could use it as building material. But it's carbohydrates, and carbohydrates mean survival. So you hack off a chunk, dunk it in whatever liquid is available to soften it enough for human consumption, and chew until your jaw aches. Now, for the beverage situation, which might be the most shocking part of your colonial breakfast. Your 6-year-old child isn't drinking orange juice or milk. They're drinking beer. Small beer, to be precise. A weak alcoholic brew that contains just enough alcohol to kill the bacteria that would otherwise kill your child. The water in your well might be contaminated with everything from animal waste to decomposing matter. Milk spoils within hours without refrigeration. But beer? Beer is safe. The brewing process kills dangerous microorganisms, creating a beverage that won't give your family dysentery. So everyone drinks it, from toddlers to grandparents, starting with breakfast and continuing throughout the day. Don't picture your child stumbling around drunk. Small beer contains only 2 to 3% alcohol, less than most modern light beers. But it's still alcohol at breakfast for children. Welcome to Colonial Family Values, where keeping your kids slightly buzzed is actually good parenting. If your family managed to slaughter an animal recently, you might have leftover meat from yesterday's dinner. But leftover doesn't mean neatly wrapped and refrigerated. It means hanging in your cold cellar, slowly developing interesting textures and questionable odors. You'll reheat it over the fire, adding to the medley of aromas already permeating your kitchen. The meat might be pork, America's favorite protein because pigs eat anything and convert garbage into edible fat. Or perhaps some salted beef that's been cured until it resembles shoe leather. Either way, you're gambling that it's still edible and won't send your family into gastrointestinal distress that could last for days. Class differences show up even at breakfast. If you're wealthy, you might have imported sugar for your mush, fresh butter for your bread, and actual tea or coffee. Your bread might be made from expensive wheat flour instead of coarse rye. You might even have chocolate, that exotic luxury that costs more than most people earn in a month. If you're poor, you're grateful for whatever mush you can scrape together. Your bread is mostly corn, your sweetener is whatever maple syrup you managed to tap last spring, and your protein comes from whatever small animals you can trap or whatever your neighbors are willing to share. The preparation alone exhausts you. By the time you've rebuilt the fire, stirred the mush, hacked the bread, and avoided being burned alive by spattering grease, you've already put in what feels like a full day's work. And it's not even 7 a.m. But here's the thing that would break a modern person's brain. This is the good part of your day. This moment, sitting around the fire with your family, sharing whatever food you've managed to create, represents security and abundance. You have food, you have shelter, you have each other. You don't yet know that in just a few months, British soldiers will be marching through your fields. You haven't yet experienced the panic of empty pantries and inflated prices. You haven't yet learned to make coffee from burnt acorns or to stretch a handful of grain into a week's worth of meals. Right now, you're still living in a time when breakfast was predictable, when you could count on having cornmeal and bread, when small beer flowed freely and meat appeared on your table with reasonable regularity. Enjoy it while it lasts, because the revolution is coming for your breakfast table. 3. The hearth that rules your life, cooking methods and tools. And when it does, you'll need every ounce of cooking skill you possess to keep your family alive. Too bad those skills might actually kill you first. You've survived breakfast, but now comes the real challenge: preparing dinner, the day's main meal. And in colonial America, cooking isn't a hobby or a creative outlet. It's a life or death battle against fire, metal, and your own inevitable human error. Every meal you prepare is essentially a controlled explosion that you're trying to aim in the direction of something edible. Let's talk about your fireplace, the 8-foot-wide monster that dominates your kitchen like a hungry dragon. This isn't some cozy hearth where you roast chestnuts and tell stories. This is an industrial furnace that consumes wood by the cord and radiates heat so intense it can singe your eyebrows from 6 feet away. The opening is large enough to roast an entire side of beef, assuming you can afford an entire side of beef and don't mind third-degree burns in the process. Inside this cavern of fire and fury, you're juggling multiple cooking operations simultaneously. Pots hang from iron cranes at different heights, each requiring different heat levels. Too close to the flames, and your stew becomes charcoal. Too far away, and you're serving lukewarm slop that could harbor enough bacteria to kill a horse. There's no thermostat, no temperature gauge, no gentle simmer setting. There's just fire, and your increasingly desperate attempts to control it. Your primary weapons in this daily warfare are implements that would look at home in a medieval torture chamber. The pot hooks and trammels, adjustable iron chains that let you raise and lower your cooking vessels, require the upper body strength of a stevedore to operate. A single large pot filled with stew can weigh more than a modern washing machine, and you're expected to lift, swing, and adjust it multiple times throughout the cooking process. Then there are the long-handled utensils, stretching 3 to 4 feet in length because getting close to your fire means losing skin. Your ladle looks like a medieval weapon. Your flesh fork could double as a pitchfork. And your slice, a flat, paddle-like tool for flipping food, requires the coordination of a fencer to use without dumping dinner into the ashes. Fire management becomes your most crucial skill, more important than any recipe or cooking technique. You don't just build a fire, you engineer it. Different cooking methods require different types of flames, different wood, and different arrangements of coals. Roasting meat demands a steady, moderate heat that can be maintained for hours. Boiling requires intense heat directly under your pot. Baking needs a bed of even coals that will provide consistent temperature without flare-ups. You become a master of wood types and their burning characteristics. Hickory for smoking meat. Oak for long, steady heat. Pine for quick kindling, but never for cooking because it makes everything taste like turpentine. Apple wood for delicate flavors. Each type burns differently, produces different amounts of heat, and creates different flavors in your food. The physical demands are relentless. You're constantly bending, lifting, stirring, and dodging sparks. Your face is perpetually flushed from heat, your hands are burned and scarred, and your back aches from hunching over fires all day. The smoke makes your eyes water and your throat raw. By evening, you're exhausted from what amounts to manual labor in a sauna while wearing long skirts and heavy clothing. Roasting meat requires its own specialized equipment and techniques. Your spit, a long iron rod, must be turned constantly to cook evenly, often for hours at a time. This is usually a child's job, sitting beside the fire turning the spit while grease drips and flames flare up. One moment of inattention and your dinner is either raw on one side or completely charred on the other. For larger roasts, you might use a jack, a clockwork mechanism that automatically turns the spit. But these expensive devices are prone to breaking, leaving you back to hand-cranking your dinner while trying not to burn down the house. The dripping fat causes constant flare-ups that you have to manage with quick reflexes and fireproof hands. Boiling seems simple until you realize that your massive iron pots take forever to heat up and even longer to cool down. Once they're hot, they stay hot for hours, continuing to cook anything inside them, whether you want them to or not. There's no off switch, no way to instantly stop the cooking process. You learn to time everything perfectly because overcooking isn't just a minor disappointment. It's the difference between dinner and starvation. Baking presents its own unique challenges. You don't have an oven with convenient temperature controls. Instead, you have a brick or stone oven that requires heating with a roaring fire built inside it. Once the walls are thoroughly heated, you rake out all the coals, sweep the floor clean, and quickly insert your bread or pies to bake as the oven slowly cools. Get the timing wrong, and your bread is either raw dough or charcoal briquettes. Dutch ovens, heavy cast iron pots with tight-fitting lids, become your versatile workhorses. You place them directly in the coals, pile more coals on top of the lid, and create a miniature oven that can bake bread, roast meat, or simmer stews. But managing the coal placement requires constant attention. Too many coals, and you burn the bottom. Too few, and nothing cooks. The lid weighs 20 pounds when hot, and lifting it while surrounded by live coals is like playing Russian roulette with your fingertips. Your cooking schedule is dictated entirely by fire management and cooking times. You start the longest cooking items first, usually a stew or soup that will simmer for hours. Then you add items that require medium cooking times. Finally, quick cooking items go on just before serving. Everything must be timed perfectly because you can't just keep things warm when your heat source is an uncontrollable inferno. The danger is constant and real. Burns are so common, they're considered part of normal life. Grease fires erupt without warning. Heavy pots tip over, sending scalding liquid across floors and feet. Children fall into fireplaces. Adults catch their clothing on fire. House fires start from a single spark landing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, somehow, meals emerge from this chaos. Tough cuts of meat become tender through hours of slow cooking. Vegetables develop complex flavors from wood smoke and cast iron. Bread emerges golden and crusty from carefully managed ovens. It's not pretty, it's not easy, and it's definitely not safe, but it works. The skills required take years to master and represent the difference between a well-fed family and slow starvation. You learn to read fire like others read books, understanding exactly what each flame and coal formation will do to your food. You develop an intuitive sense of timing, temperature, and technique that no cookbook could ever teach. But here's what you don't yet realize. These hard-won skills are about to be tested like never before. Because cooking is difficult enough when you have adequate fuel, proper ingredients, and time to do things right. Wait until you're trying to feed your family with enemy soldiers camped in your fields. 4. Regional flavors. Where you live determines what you eat. But here's the thing that might save you, or doom you entirely. Your location determines not just what you eat, but how likely you are to survive what's coming. And in colonial America, the difference between a New England kitchen and a southern plantation might as well be the difference between two completely different planets. Let's start with New England, where you wake up every morning to a landscape that's actively trying to starve you with the efficiency of a Puritan work ethic. If you're living north of Connecticut, congratulations. You've chosen to settle in a region where the growing season lasts about as long as a sneeze and the soil contains more rocks than actual earth. Your Puritan ancestors didn't come here for the easy living. They came here to prove that suffering builds character. And brother, are you about to get some character? Your New England kitchen revolves around beans. Not because you particularly love beans, but because beans are basically the only thing that will grow reliably in your harsh climate and store well through winters that seem to last roughly 11 months. Baked beans become your signature dish, not through culinary innovation, but through sheer desperate necessity. You bury a pot of beans in your fireplace coals on Saturday night. Let them cook slowly until Sunday, and pretend that this constitutes exciting weekend entertainment. The beans themselves are small, hard missiles that require overnight soaking and hours of cooking just to achieve the consistency of gravel. You flavor them with salt pork, strips of fat with just enough meat attached to justify calling it protein. Add some molasses if you can afford it, or maple syrup if you can't, and you got Sunday dinner. Every Sunday, for the rest of your natural life. Your bread is equally inspiring. Boston brown bread, dense as a brick and dark as your prospects. Made from a mixture of corn, rye, and wheat flours because no single grain alone produces enough nutrition to keep you alive. The loaf emerges from your oven looking like something you could use to build a foundation. It tastes about as good as it looks, but it keeps you from starving, which makes it a culinary masterpiece by New England standards. The ocean provides your protein salvation through cod, salmon, clams, and lobsters. But don't get excited about the lobster. It's considered poor people's food, so abundant that Massachusetts actually passes laws limiting how often you can force servants to eat it. More than 3 times a week is considered cruel and unusual punishment. Try explaining that to your modern seafood budget. Now contrast this austere existence with life in the middle colonies, where you've landed in what amounts to colonial America's Garden of Eden. Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey offer fertile soil, diverse crops, and immigrant communities that actually know how to cook. The Dutch brought pancakes, waffles, and donuts. The Germans introduced sauerkraut, sausages, and the radical concept that food should occasionally taste good. Your middle colony pantry reads like a modern farmer's market. Wheat, barley, oats, buckwheat, apples, peaches, cherries, and vegetables that actually grow without requiring divine intervention. You can make real bread from wheat flour instead of grinding up rocks and hoping for the best. Your apple orchards produce enough fruit to make cider, apple butter, and enough surplus to trade with your less fortunate neighbors. The Quaker influence means your meals are simple but substantial, with an emphasis on equality that extends to the dinner table. Servants eat alongside family members, sharing the same food rather than receiving scraps. It's a radical concept that scandals your southern neighbors and confuses your New England cousins, but creates a food culture based on abundance rather than scarcity. But if you really want to see how the other half lives, venture south into the plantation colonies, where food culture splits into two completely different universes depending on whether you own people or are owned by people. If you're wealthy enough to own a plantation, your dining table resembles something from European royalty. Multiple courses, fine wines, exotic spices, and elaborate presentations that require armies of enslaved cooks working in separate kitchen buildings. Your southern plantation dinner might feature fricasseed chicken with herbs and claret, roasted wild turkey with cornbread stuffing, rice pilaf with almonds, sweet potato pudding, and imported delicacies that cost more than most people earn in a year. Your kitchen staff numbers in the dozens, each specialized in different cooking techniques, and your smokehouse operations could supply a small army. But step into the slave quarters or visit a backcountry cabin, and you'll find people surviving on corn in every possible form: cornbread, corn mush, corn cakes, and more corn. Protein comes from whatever can be hunted, trapped, or raised on scraps. Vegetables grow in small garden plots, squeezed between more profitable cash crops. It's subsistence living in the shadow of outrageous luxury. The contrast becomes even more stark when you consider urban versus rural food access. If you're lucky enough to live in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or Charleston, you have access to import shops stocked with sugar, spices, coffee, and tea. Professional bakers produce fresh bread daily. Taverns serve hot meals to travelers. Markets sell fresh meat, vegetables, and dairy product from surrounding farms. But venture 10 miles outside these cities, and you're back to frontier self-sufficiency. No corner store, no professional baker, no market day convenience. Every calorie you consume must be grown, raised, hunted, or preserved by your own hands. The gap between urban and rural food security is so vast it might as well be different centuries. Regional drinking customs vary just as dramatically. New Englanders favor rum, cheap, strong, and imported from the Caribbean in exchange for lumber and fish. Middle colony residents drink beer and cider, benefiting from grain surpluses and apple orchards. Southerners develop a taste for whiskey made from corn, creating the foundation for bourbon culture. These regional differences aren't just cultural preferences. They're survival strategies adapted to specific environments and circumstances. New England's harsh climate demands high-calorie foods that store well. The Middle Colony's agricultural abundance allows for dietary variety and food experimentation. The South's plantation economy creates extreme wealth alongside extreme poverty, reflected in food access that ranges from European luxury to bare subsistence. Your cooking methods even vary by region. New Englanders master the art of slow-cooking tough cuts in heavy cast iron pots. Middle colony cooks develop baking skills that take advantage of excellent grains and fruits. Southern cooks create elaborate roasting and fricasseing techniques that showcase expensive ingredients and complex flavors. But here's what none of these regional differences can protect you from, or doesn't care about your local food culture. British soldiers will ransack New England fishing villages, middle colony grain farms, and southern plantations with equal enthusiasm. Blockades will cut off imports whether you're in Boston or Charleston. And when armies start marching through your region, they'll consume your carefully preserved regional specialties without bothering to appreciate the local culinary traditions. Your regional advantages are about to become regional vulnerabilities. And the war is coming for all of them. 5. Preservation or perish, keeping food through winter. But before the war destroys everything, you first have to survive the enemy that kills more colonists than any British soldier ever will. Winter. And in a world without refrigeration, freezers, or even ice, keeping food from rotting becomes a life or death science that would make a modern chemist weep with envy and terror. Let's be brutally clear about your situation. It's October 1775, and you have roughly 6 weeks to preserve enough food to keep your family alive until May. Fail, and you'll spend the winter months slowly starving while watching your children's ribs show through their skin. Succeed, and you might have enough salted meat, dried vegetables, and stored grain to make it to spring planting. No pressure. Your preservation arsenal consists of salt, smoke, cold, and prayer. That's it. No chemical preservatives, no vacuum sealing, no canning jars. Just 4 basic techniques that humans have used for thousands of years, refined through bitter experience and countless deaths from spoiled food. Salt becomes your most precious commodity, worth more per pound than some people earn in a week. You need it for preserving meat, vegetables, and dairy products. You need it for cooking. You need it for basic human health. And right now, in 1775, most of your salt comes from British-controlled sources or expensive imports that are about to become impossible to obtain. The salt curing process for pork, your primary protein source, requires knowledge that takes years to master and mistakes that can kill your entire family. You start with a freshly slaughtered pig, still warm from butchering. Every piece of meat must be carefully cut to specific thicknesses, with fat trimmed to exact proportions. Too thick and the salt won't penetrate to the center, leaving pockets of meat that will rot from the inside out. Too thin and you'll have jerky instead of preserved pork. You pack each piece in coarse salt, creating layers in wooden tubs that look like some kind of gruesome archaeological dig. The salt draws moisture from the meat through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria can't survive. But the process takes 6 weeks of constant attention. You have to check the meat regularly, replace salt that's become saturated with moisture, and turn pieces to ensure even curing. The sensory experience is overwhelming. The salt burns any small cuts on your hands. The smell of raw meat mixed with salt creates an aroma that's part ocean, part slaughterhouse. Your hands become cracked and painful from constant contact with salt, and the heavy lifting of meat and tubs leaves your back screaming by the end of each day. After salt curing comes smoking, which transforms your backyard into what looks like a small industrial operation. Your smokehouse, a wooden building roughly the size of a modern garden shed, becomes the center of your preservation universe. For the next 2 weeks, you'll maintain a continuous smoldering fire inside this building, monitoring temperature and smoke density like your life depends on it. Because it does. The wood you choose determines not just the flavor of your meat, but whether the preservation process works at all. Hickory burns slow and steady, producing the dense smoke needed for proper preservation. Oak provides consistent heat without flare-ups. Apple would add subtle flavors that make the months of salt pork slightly more bearable. Pine or other soft woods will ruin everything, creating acrid smoke that makes meat inedible. Building and maintaining the smoking fire requires skills that take years to develop. Too much heat and you're cooking the meat instead of smoking it, creating food that spoils within days. Too little smoke and bacteria will grow despite your salt curing efforts. The fire must smolder continuously for 14 days, producing thick, white smoke that penetrates every fiber of the meat. You take shifts with family members, maintaining the fire around clock. Someone must check the smokehouse every few hours, adding wood chips, adjusting airflow, and ensuring the fire hasn't gone out or flared into actual flames. Sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford during smoking season. The physical demands are relentless. Hanging heavy pieces of meat from smokehouse rafters requires ladder work while surrounded by dense smoke that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. The constant exposure to wood smoke leaves you smelling like a campfire for weeks, and the fine particles coat your hair, clothes, and skin until you feel like a walking chimney. Root cellars provide your other major preservation option, but only if you've had the foresight and physical capability to dig what amounts to an underground tomb for vegetables. Your root cellar must be at least 6 feet deep to stay below the frost line, lined with stones to prevent cave-ins, and carefully ventilated to prevent the accumulation of deadly gases from rotting vegetables. The construction alone represents weeks of backbreaking labor. You're essentially excavating your own basement using hand tools, moving tons of dirt and rocks, and hoping the whole thing doesn't collapse on your head. The walls must be perfectly constructed to maintain temperatures between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent freezing, cold enough to slow decomposition. Storing vegetables in your root cellar requires specific techniques for each type of produce. Potatoes must be buried in sand to prevent sprouting and rotting. Carrots get packed in damp sawdust. Apples are wrapped individually and stored in wooden boxes, with careful spacing to prevent one rotten apple from spoiling the entire batch. Cabbage heads are pulled up by the roots and hung from rafters. But here's the nightmare that keeps you awake at night. Despite all your efforts, preservation fails regularly and catastrophically. You'll lose entire batches of meat to improper smoking. Vegetables will rot in storage despite perfect technique. Salt supplies will run out halfway through winter, leaving you with partially preserved food that becomes dangerous to eat. The autumn preservation season becomes a community-wide frenzy of desperate activity. Every family races against time and weather, working from dawn to dusk to process enough food for winter survival. Neighbors help neighbors with large preservation projects, sharing knowledge, labor, and equipment. Because everyone understands that a preservation failure for one family affects the entire community's survival chances. Children learn preservation techniques as soon as they're old enough to hold a knife or carry firewood. These aren't optional life skills. They're the difference between community survival and community starvation. A teenager who can properly smoke meat or manage a root cellar represents valuable human capital that could save lives during bad winters. The psychological pressure is enormous. Every decision you make about preservation carries life or death consequences. Do you slaughter the pig now, while the weather is cool enough for safe processing, or wait another week and risk spoilage if temperatures rise? Do you use your remaining salt on the large cuts of pork, or save some for vegetables? How much firewood do you allocate to smoking versus heating your house? But you've mastered these skills through years of practice, passed down through generations of families who survived by learning from their mistakes and the mistakes of others. Your preservation techniques represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about keeping food safe in a dangerous world. Too bad that accumulated knowledge is about to become worthless when British blockades cut off your salt supplies and enemy soldiers burn your smokehouses. Winter has always been your enemy. Now you're about to face winter and war at the same time. 6. The social ladder on your plate, class and food. And when that war comes, it won't hit everyone equally. Your social class doesn't just determine where you live or what you wear. It determines whether you'll eat like a king or starve like a beggar when the world starts falling apart. In colonial America, your dinner plate is a crystal-clear window into your place in society, and the view from the top is very, very different from the view at the bottom. Let's start with the absolute pinnacle of colonial dining, the plantation owner's table. If you're wealthy enough to own a 1,000-acre plantation and the people who work it, your dining room resembles something from European royalty, complete with the moral emptiness that makes such luxury possible. Your dinner table stretches 12 feet long, set with imported china that costs more than most families earn in a decade, crystal goblets that catch candlelight like captured stars, and silver serving pieces that gleam with the kind of wealth that requires human bondage to maintain. Your typical dinner, served at 2 p.m. like civilized people, begins with turtle soup. Not because you particularly love turtle, but because serving exotic delicacies proves you can afford to have your enslaved cooks spend days preparing something most people will never taste. The soup is followed by fricasseed chicken swimming in wine sauce, roasted venison with herb stuffing, ham glazed with imported honey, and fish prepared in ways that require cooking skills most people will never master. Each course arrives perfectly timed, the result of a kitchen operation that employs more people than some small towns. Your head cook directs a team of specialists: pastry cooks who create elaborate desserts, sauce cooks who prepare complex accompaniments, and serving staff who know exactly when to appear and disappear. The choreography is flawless because failure means punishment, and everyone in your kitchen understands the consequences of disappointing the master of the house. Your wine cellar holds bottles imported from France, Spain, and Madeira, liquid investments that appreciate in value while waiting to be consumed. Your spice cabinet contains treasures worth their weight in silver: cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the East Indies, black pepper that costs more per pound than most people's monthly wages. You casually sprinkle these exotic seasonings on your food while your neighbors are grateful for a pinch of salt. But step down one level in colonial society, and the dining experience becomes dramatically different. As a middle-class farmer or successful artisan, your table represents honest prosperity earned through hard work and careful planning. Your dining room is smaller. The dishes are sturdy earthenware instead of fine china, and your meals are simple but substantial. Your dinner consists of one main dish, usually a hearty stew or roasted meat, accompanied by fresh bread, seasonal vegetables, and perhaps a simple pudding for dessert. You might have a glass of hard cider or small beer, but imported wine remains a special occasion luxury. Your wife prepares most meals herself, perhaps with help from a teenage daughter or hired girl, but the kitchen operation is manageable by one or two people. The food is good, filling, and nutritious. Your beef comes from your own cattle, your vegetables from your garden, your bread from grain you've grown and milled yourself. You eat well during harvest season and rely on preserved foods during winter, but you rarely go hungry unless disaster strikes. Your meals reflect the solid middle ground of colonial society. Not luxurious, not desperate, just adequately fed. Drop another level, and you enter the world of poor laborers, tenant farmers, and struggling families who spend most of their waking hours worrying about their next meal. Your dining table is a rough wooden plank. Your dishes are whatever ceramic or wooden bowls you can afford, and your meals consist primarily of whatever fills your stomach cheapest. Corn becomes your primary sustenance in every possible form. Cornbread for breakfast, corn mush for dinner, corn cakes for supper. Meat appears on your table maybe once a week, usually salt pork or whatever small game you can trap or shoot. Vegetables come from your tiny garden plot, assuming you have land to plant one and time to tend it between working for wages that barely keep you alive. Your children go to bed hungry regularly, not starving, exactly, but never quite full, never satisfied, always aware that food is scarce and precious. They learn early not to ask for seconds, not to complain about the monotony of corn-based meals, and not to expect the treats and variety that wealthier children take for granted. But the bottom of colonial food hierarchy reveals the true horror of a society built on human bondage. If you're enslaved, your weekly food ration is calculated with the cold precision of feeding livestock. Exactly enough calories to keep you working, never enough to satisfy hunger or provide the nutrition needed for optimal health. Your weekly allowance typically includes a quart of cornmeal and half a pound of salt pork per day, sometimes supplemented with sweet potatoes, field peas, or whatever vegetables your master decides you deserve. This ration provides bare subsistence nutrition, enough to prevent starvation, insufficient for anything resembling healthy eating. But here's where enslaved people's ingenuity and resilience become apparent. You supplement these inadequate rations through whatever means possible. Small garden plots around the slave quarters produce collard greens, beans, squash, and other vegetables. Hunting and fishing in spare time, assuming you have any, provide additional protein. Trading skills or small crafts with neighboring farms might earn extra food. Your cooking methods are necessarily simple and efficient. One-pot meals that can simmer while you work in the fields. Vegetables cooked with whatever fat or meat scraps are available. Cornbread baked on hoe blades over open fires, creating the hoe cake that becomes a staple of Southern cuisine. You create flavorful, nutritious meals from minimal ingredients through cooking techniques that prioritize nutrition and taste over presentation. The psychological impact of food insecurity affects every aspect of enslaved life. Never knowing if next week's rations will arrive on time. Never having enough food to feel truly satisfied. Watching your children receive smaller portions while the master's children feast on delicacies prepared by your own hands. The constant awareness that your basic nutrition depends entirely on someone else's decision to keep you adequately fed. Women bear the heaviest burden in this system, regardless of social class. Wealthy plantation mistresses manage complex household operations that feed dozens of people daily. Middle-class farm wives balance field work with food preparation, preservation, and family care. Poor women struggle to stretch inadequate resources into meals that keep their families alive. Enslaved women often work in the fields all day, then return to their quarters to prepare meals for their own families using whatever ingredients they can gather. The preparation time alone reveals class differences. Wealthy families spend hours on elaborate meal preparation, but they're not doing the work themselves. Middle-class families invest significant time in cooking, but treat it as necessary domestic labor. Poor families focus on quick, filling meals that provide maximum nutrition for minimum time and expense. Enslaved families must accomplish food preparation in whatever time remains after completing their assigned labor. Kitchen equipment reflects these same class divisions. Wealthy kitchens contain specialized tools for every cooking task. Separate pots for different types of cooking, professional quality knives, elaborate serving pieces, and cooking equipment that represents major financial investments. Middle-class kitchens feature sturdy, practical equipment that can handle daily use but lacks specialized refinements. Poor kitchens make do with basic cast iron pots, simple knives, and whatever utensils can be afforded or crafted by hand. These food-based class distinctions create social divisions that extend far beyond the dinner table. Children from different classes grow up with completely different expectations about food availability, variety, and quality. These early experiences shape adult attitudes about social hierarchy, personal worth, and what constitutes an acceptable standard of living. But the Revolutionary War is about to scramble all these carefully maintained social distinctions. Because when armies start marching through the countryside, they don't check your social status before taking your food. 1775, when war comes for your dinner. April 19th, 1775. You're probably tending your garden or feeding your chickens when you hear the news that changes everything. Shots fired at Lexington and Concord. British soldiers marching through Massachusetts farmland. Colonial militia grabbing their muskets and running toward the sound of gunfire. And in that moment, your biggest concern shifts from whether you'll have enough preserved meat for winter to whether you'll have any food at all by next month. Welcome to the Revolutionary War, where the battle for independence will be fought not just on famous battlefields, but in your kitchen, your garden, your smokehouse, and your increasingly empty pantry. The war that history books describe in terms of politics and principles is about to become brutally personal, measured in empty stomachs and desperate meals made from whatever scraps you can find. The transformation happens faster than you can believe. 1 week you're living in a world where food follows predictable patterns, seasonal availability, market prices, trade relationships that have existed for decades. The next week, everything you thought you knew about feeding your family becomes obsolete overnight. Your first hint that something fundamental has changed comes when a group of Continental soldiers appears at your farm gate. They're polite, apologetic even, but they're carrying muskets and they're not taking no for an answer. They need provisions for the cause of liberty. Your livestock, your grain stores, your carefully preserved meat, all suddenly essential to the war effort. You can be compensated, they assure you. Eventually, maybe, if the Continental Congress can figure out how to pay for a war with money that doesn't exist yet. You watch your best milk cow disappear down the road, along with 2 pigs you've been fattening for winter slaughter and half your stored grain. The soldiers are fighting for your freedom, they explain, and you want to support the cause. But as you watch your food security walking away on four legs, you start to understand that freedom has a very immediate, very personal cost that no one mentioned in all those stirring speeches about taxation without representation. But the Continental Army is just the beginning of your food problems. British foraging parties sweep through colonial areas with the systematic efficiency of locusts, taking whatever they need for His Majesty's forces. They're not particularly concerned with your family's survival prospects or your carefully planned winter food stores. To them, your livestock represents military supplies, your grain means army rations, and your objections are the irrelevant complaints of colonial rebels who brought this trouble on themselves. The requisitioning process becomes a grim lottery that could bankrupt any family overnight. Today it's your neighbor's farm. Tomorrow it might be yours. You start hiding food in root cellars, burying grain in the woods, and driving your remaining livestock to hidden pastures miles from main roads. But armies are made up of men who grew up on farms, and they know all the hiding places you know. Local food prices begin their inexorable climb toward the stratosphere. The merchant who sold you salt pork for 8 pence a pound last month now wants 2 shillings for the same cut. Sugar, when you can find it at all, costs more than you used to spend on meat for a week. The supply chains that brought goods from the Caribbean, from other colonies, from across the Atlantic, are breaking down under the pressure of war, blockades, and simple uncertainty about what's safe to transport. But it's not just about higher prices. Entire categories of food start disappearing from markets altogether. West India molasses, essential for sweetening and rum production, becomes scarce as British naval patrols disrupt trade routes. European wine and luxury foods vanish from merchant shelves. Even domestic products become unreliable as farmers focus on hiding food from armies rather than bringing it to market. Your preservation calculations, so carefully planned around seasonal cycles and family needs, suddenly include variables you never imagined. How much food should you hide versus how much you can risk storing normally? Do you slaughter livestock early to avoid losing them to requisitioning, even though early slaughter means less meat per animal and more preservation challenges? How do you plan for winter when you don't know what resources you'll have next month? The social fabric of rural communities begins fraying under the stress of food insecurity. Neighbors who shared resources and labor for generations start hoarding supplies and viewing each other with suspicion. Is your neighbor sympathetic to the British? Will he report the grain you're hiding to the next group of soldiers? Can you trust him with information about your food caches, or will he use that knowledge to protect his own family at your expense? Children notice the changes first. Portions get smaller. Meat appears less frequently. The special treats that marked celebrations and holidays disappear from family traditions. Parents start having whispered conversations about food that stop when children enter the room. Kids develop that hollow-eyed look of chronic hunger that becomes disturbingly common in war zones. Women bear the heaviest burden of adapting family food strategies to wartime conditions. They must stretch shrinking supplies across the same number of mouths, maintain preservation operations with reduced salt and sugar, and create edible meals from whatever ingredients remain available. The domestic skills that once meant the difference between adequate nutrition and seasonal hunger now mean the difference between survival and starvation. Your cooking methods adapt to new realities. Recipes that called for meat get modified to use whatever protein you can find. Bread recipes change to incorporate whatever grains are available, even if they produce loaves with the taste and texture of compressed sawdust. You learn to make coffee from roasted grain, chicory, or whatever bitter plants might fool your palate into believing you're drinking something civilized. The psychological impact hits harder than the physical hunger. You've spent your entire life building food security through careful planning, hard work, and community cooperation. Now external forces beyond your control can destroy months of effort in a single afternoon. The sense of helplessness becomes overwhelming as you realize that traditional survival strategies may not work in a world where armies consume everything in their path. Military camps spring up near your community, bringing thousands of hungry soldiers who need to eat whether or not local food supplies can support them. The army promises to pay for provisions, but payment comes in continental currency that merchants increasingly refuse to accept. You're expected to provide food for soldiers fighting for your freedom, but feeding them might mean starving your own family. Trading relationships that sustained communities for decades collapse under wartime pressures. The merchant who used to extend credit until harvest time now demands immediate payment in hard currency. The miller who ground your grain in exchange for a portion of the flour now charges cash fees you can't afford. The social networks that once provided emergency food assistance during hard times are overwhelmed by the number of families facing food crises simultaneously. Your weekly trips to town reveal a landscape of empty shops, closed businesses, and desperate merchants trying to maintain trade with increasingly worthless currency. The market days that once provided social connection and reliable food sources become exercises in frustration as you search for goods that simply aren't available at any price. And this is just the beginning. The war has barely started, and already your food world is collapsing around you. Wait until the British start their systematic campaign to starve the colonies into submission. Wait until winter arrives and your hidden food stores run out. Wait until you learn what real hunger feels like. 8. Tea, politics, and empty pantries. Food as resistance. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. Before the war even starts starving you, you're going to starve yourself. On purpose. Because in the most bizarre turn of events in human history, your morning beverage has become a political statement, and your breakfast choices are now acts of treason or loyalty, depending on which side of the revolution you support. Let's rewind to December 16th, 1773, when a group of colonial men dressed as Mohawk Indians dumped 342 chests of perfectly good tea into Boston Harbor. You probably thought this was about taxes and politics. You were wrong. This was about fundamentally changing what Americans eat and drink, and the consequences are about to reach into your kitchen and rearrange your entire relationship with food. Tea isn't just a beverage in colonial America. It's a social institution, a daily ritual, and for many families, the one luxury that makes life bearable. Your afternoon tea service, however modest, represents civilization, refinement, and connection to European culture. The delicate porcelain cups, the careful brewing process, the social gathering around the tea table. All of this is about to become evidence of political treason. The morning after news of the Tea Party reaches your community, you face the most ridiculous dilemma in human history. Is drinking tea an act of supporting British tyranny? Your tea caddy, once a prized possession carefully rationed to last between expensive purchases, suddenly looks like a political landmine sitting on your kitchen shelf. Do you drink it and risk being labeled a loyalist sympathizer? Or do you pour it out and demonstrate your commitment to colonial resistance? Your neighbors are wrestling with the same absurd decision, and the results vary wildly depending on their political convictions and caffeine dependency. Mrs. Henderson down the road dumps her entire tea supply in her garden, declaring that she'd rather drink swamp water than support British oppression. Her husband, secretly addicted to his morning tea, begins sneaking cups of the forbidden beverage in his barn like some kind of caffeinated criminal. The social pressure becomes intense and immediate. Tea drinking transforms from a pleasant social activity into a political loyalty test. When you invite neighbors for an afternoon visit, your beverage choice communicates your political allegiance as clearly as flying a flag. Serve tea, and you're supporting King George. Serve anything else, and you're standing with the Sons of Liberty. Coffee becomes the patriotic alternative, but here's the problem. Coffee costs more than tea, requires different preparation methods, and tastes like bitter mud compared to the refined flavors you're accustomed to. Your first attempt at coffee brewing produces a liquid so intensely awful that you seriously consider whether political resistance is worth this level of gustatory punishment. The coffee learning curve proves steep and expensive. You need different equipment, coffee mills, different pots, and knowledge about roasting beans that no one in your community possesses. The brewing process requires experimentation that wastes precious coffee beans while you figure out proper proportions and timing. Your early coffee attempts produce beverages ranging from weak brown water to liquid charcoal, none of which provide the comforting morning ritual that tea represented. But coffee shortage problems pale compared to the creativity required for Liberty Tea, the collection of domestic plant substitutes that patriotic Americans concoct to replace their beloved British import. You join your neighbors in gathering everything from raspberry leaves to pine needles, creating beverages that range from merely unpleasant to potentially poisonous. New Jersey tea, made from Ceanothus americanus, becomes the most popular substitute, producing a reddish brew that vaguely resembles actual tea if you squint and use your imagination. Sweet fern creates an aromatic but strange-tasting beverage. Sassafras root provides a distinctive flavor that's either refreshing or nauseating, depending on your perspective and desperation level. Chamomile flowers, violet leaves, and strawberry leaves all get pressed into service as tea substitutes. Your kitchen transforms into an experimental laboratory where you're constantly brewing new combinations of local plants, hoping to discover something that doesn't taste like you're drinking lawn clippings. The results vary from surprisingly pleasant to immediately regrettable. Women lead the resistance movement through organized boycotts that transform grocery shopping into political activism. The Daughters of Liberty coordinate community-wide agreements to refuse British goods, creating social pressure that makes individual resistance choices into collective political action. Your weekly market trip becomes an exercise in reading political meaning into every purchase decision. Sugar presents another political dilemma because most colonial sugar comes from British-controlled Caribbean islands. Supporting the sugar trade means supporting the British economy and, by extension, British oppression. But sugar sweetens everything from your morning porridge to your evening pudding. Giving up sugar means fundamentally changing how your food tastes and your family's expectations about meals. Maple syrup and honey become patriotic sweetener alternatives, but both require different cooking techniques and produce different flavors than refined sugar. Your baking recipes need complete revision to accommodate these substitutes. Honey crystallizes differently than sugar. Maple syrup adds flavors that don't work with every dish. Your family's favorite desserts become culinary experiments with unpredictable results. The political meaning of food choices creates social divisions within families and communities. Your loyalist uncle continues drinking tea and using imported sugar, creating uncomfortable tension at family gatherings. Do you serve him coffee and maple syrup cookies as a political statement? Or do you accommodate his preferences and risk appearing to support British policies? Children become confused by the sudden transformation of normal foods into political issues. Why is tea bad now when it was good last month? Why does father make faces when drinking coffee, but insist it's better than tea? Why do some neighbors refuse to visit families who still serve British goods? The adult world's political obsessions filter down to children through food restrictions they can't understand. Local merchants struggle with the economic reality of boycotts that eliminate their most profitable inventory. The shopkeeper who built his business around imported British goods faces financial ruin if the boycotts continue. But selling British products marks him as a loyalist sympathizer, potentially destroying his customer base and exposing him to political violence. Food riots begin erupting as women take direct action against merchants suspected of hoarding scarce goods or charging excessive prices for domestic alternatives. In Boston, a group of women confronts coffee merchant Thomas Boylston, demanding he sell coffee at reasonable prices. When he refuses, they physically seize him and force him to surrender his warehouse keys, distributing coffee to families who can't afford inflated prices. These food riots represent something new in colonial politics, direct action by women who traditionally stayed out of public political activities. But food shortages and price inflation affect women most directly, as they're responsible for feeding families with increasingly inadequate resources. The personal becomes political when your children go hungry because merchants are profiteering from wartime scarcity. The Continental Association, formed in 1774, formalizes food-based resistance through comprehensive boycotts of British goods. Local committees enforce compliance, monitoring which families purchase prohibited items, and applying social pressure to maintain community solidarity. Your shopping list becomes subject to political oversight, with neighbors watching to ensure your purchases support colonial resistance. Homespun clothing becomes another symbol of resistance, as colonists refuse to purchase British textiles. Buy American extends beyond food to everything from fabric to furniture, creating an early version of economic nationalism that links consumer choices to political loyalty. Your family's appearance becomes a political statement about your commitment to colonial independence. The irony becomes apparent as food-based political resistance creates the shortages and substitutions that will make wartime hunger even more severe. You're voluntarily giving up imported foods that will soon become impossible to obtain through British blockades. Your patriotic coffee drinking prepares you for a world where tea truly isn't available, regardless of your political preferences. But right now, in this moment before the war makes these choices mandatory, your food boycotts feel like powerful political action. You're striking a blow for liberty with every cup of bitter coffee and every spoonful of maple syrup. You have no idea that soon you'll be grateful for any beverage you can find, regardless of its political implications. 9. Continental Army cuisine, soldiers' starvation. Because while you're at home experimenting with pine needle tea and debating the politics of sugar, the Continental Army is discovering that patriotism doesn't fill empty stomachs. And fighting for freedom is significantly more difficult when you're slowly dying of starvation. Welcome to military cuisine, 1777 style, where the menu consists of whatever you can forage, steal, or scrape from the bottom of empty barrels. Let's drop you into the boots of Private Joseph Plum Martin, a Connecticut farm boy who enlisted to fight for liberty and instead found himself fighting for survival in what amounts to history's most poorly catered revolution. You've been marching for weeks, your uniform is falling apart, your feet are wrapped in rags because your shoes disintegrated months ago, and your stomach feels like it's trying to digest itself from the inside out. The official daily ration, as decreed by the Continental Congress in their infinite wisdom from comfortable chairs in Philadelphia, sounds almost generous. 1 pound of fresh beef or 3/4 of a pound of pork, plus bread, vegetables, and rum. On paper, it's enough to keep a soldier healthy and fighting fit. In reality, it's a cruel joke that exists only in the imaginations of politicians who've never tried to feed an army with money that doesn't exist and supply chains that collapse every time someone sneezes. Your actual daily ration consists of whatever the quartermaster managed to scrounge yesterday, divided among however many soldiers showed up for roll call, multiplied by the probability that the supply wagons didn't get lost, stolen, or requisitioned by officers who outrank your immediate commanders. The mathematics of military hunger are brutally simple. There's never enough food, and what little exists goes to whoever has the most stripes on their sleeves. Welcome to Valley Forge, winter of 1777 to 78, where you're about to receive an education in exactly how close to starvation the human body can survive while still being expected to function as a fighting force. The encampment stretches for miles, filled with 12,000 soldiers who are supposed to represent the military might of a nascent American nation. Instead, you represent 12,000 slowly dying scarecrows wrapped in whatever fabric you can find. Your primary food source has been reduced to something called fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked over coals that achieves the consistency of charcoal-flavored cement. The recipe is elegantly simple. Take whatever flour you can find, mix it with water to form a paste, flatten it into patties, and bake it on hot rocks or the ashes of your campfire until the outside becomes crispy and the inside reaches the approximate texture of wet sawdust. Dr. Albigence Waldo, camp physician and reluctant food critic, describes your dining experience with the precision of someone documenting a slow-motion disaster. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery, vomit half my time, smocked out of my senses. His medical training allows him to catalog the various ways malnutrition is destroying the Continental Army one soldier at a time. The fire cake itself defies description by any reasonable culinary standards. When fresh, and fresh is a relative term for something made from flour that might contain weevils, dust, and whatever else got mixed in during storage. It has the texture of dense, gritty bread. After sitting for a day, it achieves the consistency of roof tiles. After a week, you could use it as ammunition, assuming your musket could handle firing objects harder than the cannonballs you're supposed to be shooting at the British. But even fire cake becomes a luxury when the flour runs out entirely. You learn to forage like a desperate animal, searching the frozen ground for anything remotely edible. Tree bark, when stripped from the inner layer and boiled for hours, produces a fibrous mush that fills your stomach without providing any actual nutrition. Roots, when you can dig them from frozen ground, offer the illusion of eating while your body continues consuming itself. Joseph Plum Martin captures the psychological torture of constant hunger with the weary precision of someone who's lived it. I had eaten nothing since the noon of the preceding day, nor did I eat a morsel till the forenoon of the next day, and I needed rest as much as victuals. The casual way he mentions going 36 hours without food reveals how normal starvation has become in military life. The physical effects of chronic malnutrition become visible throughout the camp. Soldiers who enlisted as healthy farm boys now resemble walking skeletons, their clothes hanging loose on frames that seem to shrink daily. Wounds heal slowly or not at all. Minor illnesses become major health crises when bodies lack the nutrition needed for basic immune function. Dental problems explode as vitamin deficiencies cause gums to bleed and teeth to loosen. Mental functioning deteriorates along with physical health. Soldiers struggle to follow simple orders, not from insubordination, but from a mental fog that accompanies severe hunger. Decision-making becomes impaired. Attention spans shrink. The kind of quick thinking required in combat becomes nearly impossible when your brain is operating on fumes. The camp's foraging expeditions transform soldiers into scavenging parties that strip the countryside bare within a 20-mile radius of Valley Forge. Everything remotely edible disappears. Wild onions, nuts left over from autumn, even grass and leaves when desperation peaks. Local farmers hide their remaining livestock in grain stores, knowing that hungry soldiers are just one step away from becoming organized looters. Water provides its own challenges when you're too weak to properly maintain sanitation systems. The creeks around Valley Forge become contaminated with human waste, creating a choice between dehydration and dysentery. Melting snow for drinking water requires fuel for fires, but would become scarce when 12,000 men are burning everything combustible to stay warm and cook whatever scraps they can find. The social hierarchy of hunger creates additional psychological torment. Officers, even when sharing the general scarcity, often have access to slightly better rations or the ability to purchase food from local sources with personal funds. Watching your commanding officer eat a proper meal while you're gnawing on fire cake adds insult to the injury of starvation. Military discipline begins breaking down as hunger overrides training and patriotic commitment. Soldiers desert in increasing numbers, not because they've lost faith in the cause, but because they've lost faith in their ability to survive another week of systematic starvation. Court-martial records from Valley Forge read like a catalog of hunger-driven crimes, stealing food from fellow soldiers, leaving posts to forage, and trading military equipment for anything edible. The irony becomes inescapable. An army fighting for the principle that governments should serve the people is being systematically abandoned by the government it's trying to create. The Continental Congress continues meeting in heated buildings while soldiers freeze and starve. State governments promise supplies that never arrive. Local communities, stripped bare by previous military foraging, have nothing left to provide even when they support the cause. Your letters home, when you have energy to write them, begin focusing exclusively on food. You describe every meal in detail, partly because there's so little to describe and partly because hunger makes food the only thing worth thinking about. Your family's complaints about coffee substitutes and sugar shortages seem almost laughably trivial compared to your daily struggle to consume enough calories to avoid complete physical collapse. The philosophical questions become immediate and personal. What kind of independence is worth this level of suffering? How can an army defend principles of human dignity while its soldiers are reduced to animal-like scavenging for survival? If the British offered adequate food in exchange for surrender, how many soldiers would accept the trade? But somehow, impossibly, the army holds together through sheer stubborn determination and the knowledge that surrender means the end of everything you've sacrificed for. You survive on willpower when food runs out, on camaraderie when willpower fails, and on the desperate hope that spring will bring supplies, reinforcements, and the possibility of eating something more substantial than charcoal-flavored paste. The British, warm and well-fed in Philadelphia, have no idea how close they are to winning the war simply by waiting for the Continental Army to starve itself into surrender. They should have waited a little longer. 10. The home front starves too, civilian wartime food. But they didn't need to wait because the starvation wasn't limited to Valley Forge. While soldiers were eating fire cake and tree bark, you were at home discovering that being a civilian in wartime doesn't protect you from hunger. It just means you starve in the comfort of your own kitchen while watching your children's faces grow gaunt and your neighbors become increasingly desperate. Welcome to the home front, where the Revolutionary War isn't a distant conflict fought by other people, but a daily battle for survival that's being waged in your pantry, your garden, and your increasingly frantic attempts to stretch a handful of grain into something resembling a meal. The romantic notion that wars are fought by soldiers while civilians go about their normal lives is about to die a brutal death in your kitchen. The British naval blockade hits your dinner table with the precision of a military operation designed to starve an entire population into submission. Those West Indian ships that used to arrive regularly with sugar, molasses, and rum, they're sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic or rotting in British-controlled ports. The European vessels carrying wine, tea, and luxury goods, turned away or captured before they reach colonial harbors. Your sugar bowl, once routinely refilled from Caribbean imports, now sits empty most of the time. When you can find sugar at all, it costs more than you used to spend on a month's worth of meat. Molasses, essential for sweetening everything from bread to puddings, becomes so expensive that you measure it by the spoonful rather than the cup. Your family's sweet tooth becomes a luxury you simply can't afford. But the blockade's impact extends far beyond expensive sweets. Salt, crucial for preserving meat through winter, becomes scarce enough to cause genuine panic. Without adequate salt, your carefully planned food preservation strategies collapse, leaving you watching expensive meat spoil because you can't cure it properly. The salt shortage forces impossible choices. Use your remaining supply to preserve pork for winter, or season your family's current meals to make them palatable. Tea disappears entirely from many households, not through patriotic boycott, but through simple unavailability at any price. Coffee becomes so expensive that you start mixing it with roasted grain, chicory, or whatever else might fool your palate into believing you're drinking something civilized. Your morning beverage routine, once a reliable comfort, becomes an exercise in creative substitution and disappointment. The inflation of food prices reaches levels that would make modern economists weep. Continental currency, printed in increasingly desperate quantities to fund the war effort, loses value so rapidly that farmers prefer barter to cash transactions. The phrase, "not worth a continental," becomes common vocabulary as paper money becomes, quite literally, worth less than the paper it's printed on. Your weekly market trip transforms into an exercise in mathematical horror. Beef that cost 6 pence per pound last year now sells for 4 shillings, assuming you can find any for sale. Wheat flour, when available, costs more than many families' entire monthly income. Your food budget, carefully calculated to last through winter, now covers perhaps 2 weeks of basic nutrition if you're lucky. Local farmers, facing their own survival crises, stop bringing surplus food to market. Why sell grain for worthless paper money when you might need every kernel to feed your own family through winter? Why part with livestock when the next military unit might requisition your remaining animals. The market economy that once provided reliable food access simply stops functioning when everyone becomes focused on hoarding whatever they can find. Military foraging parties continue their systematic emptying of civilian food stores, but now they're competing with British forces, loyalist militias, and increasingly desperate neighbors. Your carefully hidden grain cache might be discovered by Continental soldiers on Monday, British foragers on Wednesday, and hungry neighbors on Friday. The concept of food security becomes meaningless when anyone with weapons can claim your family's winter stores for the cause. Women organize and fight back through food riots that reveal just how desperate civilian conditions have become. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, groups of women physically confront merchants suspected of hoarding scarce goods or charging excessive prices. These aren't polite protests. They're desperate mothers using whatever force necessary to feed their children. The July 1777 Boston coffee riot becomes legendary when a crowd of women surrounds merchant Thomas Boylston's warehouse. When he refuses to sell coffee at reasonable prices, they physically seize him, grab his keys, and distribute his hoarded supplies to families who can't afford inflated prices. The image of respectable colonial women literally wresting warehouse keys from a profiteering merchant reveals how completely normal social boundaries have collapsed under wartime pressure. Your children adapt to the new reality with the resilience that kids show when adults can no longer shield them from harsh truths. They stop asking for seconds at meals, understanding instinctively that there aren't any. They don't complain about the increasingly creative substitutions you make when familiar foods disappear. They learn to eat whatever appears on their plates without questions about taste, texture, or nutritional adequacy. But children's adaptability can't hide the physical reality of chronic malnutrition. You watch your kids' clothes become loose, their faces lose the roundness of healthy childhood, and their energy levels drop as their growing bodies compete with inadequate food supplies. The hollow-eyed look that becomes common among wartime children haunts parents who remember when their biggest concern was whether kids would eat their vegetables. Community support networks, traditionally strong in colonial society, begin breaking down under the pressure of universal scarcity. Neighbors who once shared resources during temporary hardships now hoard whatever they can find, viewing other families as competition for survival rather than friends in need. The social fabric that held rural communities together starts fraying when everyone faces potential starvation. Church congregations, once sources of mutual aid during difficult times, struggle to help anyone when everyone needs help simultaneously. The traditional Christian obligation to feed the hungry becomes impossible when no one has surplus food to share. Ministers find themselves preaching about faith and perseverance to congregations that are slowly starving in their pews. Your preservation skills, developed over years of seasonal food management, become inadequate for wartime conditions. Traditional preservation methods require salt, sugar, and consistent fuel supplies that are no longer reliably available. You learn to preserve food with whatever materials you can find, often with results that range from barely edible to potentially dangerous. The psychological stress becomes as debilitating as the physical hunger. You lie awake calculating how to stretch remaining food stores through winter while knowing the mathematics don't work. You make impossible decisions about family food distribution, choosing which children get larger portions based on age, health, or work contributions. The mental burden of constant food insecurity affects every aspect of daily life. Social gatherings that once centered around shared meals become painful reminders of abundance that no longer exists. Church suppers, community celebrations, and family gatherings either disappear entirely or become grim affairs where everyone pretends not to notice how little food is available. The social rituals that once strengthened community bonds become sources of embarrassment and stress. Your cooking skills expand in directions you never imagined, as you learn to create meals from ingredients that previous generations would have considered inedible. Tree bark bread, nettle soup, and various grass-based dishes become regular menu items as you experiment with anything that might provide nutrition without causing immediate poisoning. The irony becomes clear. You're fighting a war for independence while becoming dependent on whatever scraps you can find to keep your family alive. And the worst part? The war is just getting started. 11. Creative desperation. Wartime food substitutions. So you're going to need to get creative. And by creative, we mean you're about to discover exactly how many inedible things can be transformed into something vaguely resembling food through sheer desperation, questionable judgment, and the kind of innovation that only emerges when the alternative is starvation. Welcome to Wartime Cooking, where the recipe for everything starts with find something that won't immediately kill you and ends with pray it tastes better than it looks. Your morning coffee routine becomes an exercise in alchemical experimentation that would impress medieval wizards. Real coffee beans, when you can find them, cost more than you used to spend on a week's worth of meat. So you learn the fine art of creating coffee from whatever you can burn, grind, and convince yourself might produce a caffeinated beverage if you squint and use enough imagination. Chicory root becomes your first desperate coffee substitute, requiring you to dig, clean, roast, and grind a bitter root that produces a dark liquid with roughly the same relationship to coffee that pond water has to wine. The process involves hours of labor for a beverage that tastes like someone dissolved dirt in hot water, but it's brown, it's bitter, and it's hot, which makes it close enough to coffee for wartime standards. When chicory runs out, you escalate to roasted grain coffee made from whatever wheat, barley, or corn you can spare from your family's already inadequate food supplies. The roasting process requires careful attention to prevent burning expensive grain into inedible charcoal, followed by grinding and brewing techniques that produce a drink resembling coffee in color only. The taste falls somewhere between burnt cereal and liquid disappointment. Acorns become another coffee substitute, but only after you learn the complex process of removing tannins that make them naturally inedible. You shell the acorns, grind them coarsely, then leach them repeatedly in water to remove the bitter compounds that would otherwise make your coffee taste like you're drinking tree bark. After days of processing, you have a handful of acorn meal that, when roasted and brewed, produces a beverage that's marginally less awful than dirt soup. Dandelion roots offer yet another coffee alternative, requiring you to dig up weeds from your yard and roast them until they achieve the proper darkness. The resulting brew has a distinctive bitterness that almost resembles coffee, assuming you've never actually tasted real coffee and have no basis for comparison. Children adapt quickly to these substitutes, having never known anything better, while adults spend mornings trying to convince themselves that roasted dandelion root is just as satisfying as the imported beans they remember. Sugar substitutions force you to become an expert in alternative sweetening methods that require entirely different cooking techniques. Maple syrup, when you can obtain it, demands learning new baking chemistry because it contains more water than refined sugar and produces different textures in bread and desserts. Your familiar cake recipes become experimental disasters as you try to figure out proper substitution ratios for liquid sweeteners. Honey presents similar challenges, with flavors that range from delicate wildflower to overpowering buckwheat, depending on what the bees were eating. Some honey varieties work well in certain recipes and completely overpower others. You learn through expensive trial and error which dishes can handle strong honey flavors and which require the delicate sweetness that only refined sugar can provide. Tree sap from birch, walnut, and other trees becomes a sweetener source when maple ISN grow available, but extracting usable syrup requires tapping trees, collecting sap, and boiling it down in ratios that make maple syrup production look efficient. 20 gallons of birch sap might produce 1 gallon of syrup after hours of fuel-intensive boiling, assuming you can spare the wood for such extended cooking projects. Salt shortages force the most desperate substitutions because salt is essential for food preservation, not just flavoring. You learn to extract salt from salt water by evaporation, a process that requires hauling seawater inland and burning precious fuel to boil away water until salt crystals remain. The resulting salt often contains impurities that affect taste and preservation effectiveness, but it's better than watching meat spoil from lack of proper curing. Wood ash provides sodium for preservation through lye production, but creating edible lye requires knowledge about which woods produce safe ash and how to process it without creating caustic solutions that will poison your family. The chemistry involved in making potash from wood ash becomes essential survival knowledge, passed between neighbors like secret recipes for staying alive. Bread substitutions reveal just how creative desperation can make people when wheat flour becomes unavailable or unaffordable. You learn to make bread from cornmeal, but corn bread requires different techniques than wheat bread and produces a completely different texture and taste. Corn bread doesn't rise the same way, crumbles differently, and goes stale faster than wheat bread, requiring adjustments to your entire bread-making routine. Acorn flour, after the lengthy tannin removal process, can be mixed with cornmeal to extend grain supplies and add nutrition to bread recipes. The resulting loaves have a dense, nutty flavor that's either rustic and satisfying or heavy and unpleasant, depending on your perspective and hunger level. Acorn bread keeps well, but requires acquired taste and strong jaw muscles. Chestnut flour becomes another bread substitute in regions where chestnut trees grow abundantly. Chestnuts must be shelled, dried, and ground in a flour that produces sweet, dense bread with distinctive flavors. Chestnut bread spoils quickly and requires immediate consumption, making it impractical for families who need bread that lasts several days. Bean flour made from dried, ground beans extends wheat supplies, but produces bread with protein-rich nutrition and heavy texture. Lima beans, navy beans, and other varieties can be dried and ground in a meal that, when mixed with corn flour, creates bread that's nutritionally superior to pure grain bread, but texturally challenging for people accustomed to light wheat bread. Root vegetables become bread ingredients when grain runs low. Potatoes can be cooked, mashed, and mixed with whatever flour is available to create potato bread that's moist, dense, and surprisingly filling. Sweet potatoes, turnips, and even carrots can be processed into bread ingredients when desperation demands creative use of available food supplies. Your spice cabinet empties quickly as imported seasonings become unavailable, forcing you to rely on whatever grows locally. Wild onions, garlic, and herbs foraged from fields and forests become your primary seasonings. Pine needles can be used sparingly for flavoring, though too much creates a resinous taste that makes food inedible. Sassafras, wintergreen, and other native plants provide flavoring for both food and beverages. You learn which local plants are safe for consumption and which contain compounds that could poison your family. The knowledge becomes crucial as you experiment with unfamiliar plants in desperate attempts to add variety to increasingly monotonous meals. Meat substitutions reveal the limits of creative cooking when protein becomes scarce. Fish, when available, requires different cooking techniques than the meat you're accustomed to preparing. Wild game has stronger flavors and different textures than domestic livestock, requiring seasoning and cooking adjustments to make it palatable for families used to beef and pork. Small game like squirrels, rabbits, and birds become regular protein sources, but processing them requires skills that many colonial families never needed to develop. Learning to skin, clean, and cook wild animals becomes essential knowledge as domestic livestock disappears into military requisitions or becomes too expensive to slaughter. Even insects become protein sources in the most desperate circumstances. Grasshoppers, when roasted properly, provide nutrition and can be ground into meal for extending other foods. The psychological barrier to eating insects proves harder to overcome than the practical challenges of preparation. But hunger eventually overcomes cultural taboos about what constitutes acceptable food. These substitutions work sometimes, fail catastrophically other times, and always require more labor than the original foods they're replacing. But they keep your family alive when the alternative is starvation. And every successful substitution you master today prepares you for even worse shortages tomorrow. 12. Tavern culture, where revolution was planned over dinner. But here's the strange thing about wartime. Even as families struggle with acorn coffee and tree bark bread in their own kitchens, people still need places to gather, to share information, and to plot revolution over whatever food can be scraped together. Welcome to the Colonial Tavern, where democracy is being born over bowls of hasty pudding and mugs of hard cider, and where the woman running the establishment is performing daily miracles by keeping anyone fed when half the countryside is starving. Your local tavern isn't just a place to grab a drink. It's the beating heart of your community, serving simultaneously as restaurant, hotel, courthouse, post office, political meeting hall, and gossip central. If you want to know what's happening in the war, who's been requisitioned by which army, or where you might find salt at a reasonable price, the tavern is where you go. And if you're lucky, you might even get something resembling a hot meal while you're gathering intelligence. Let's follow you through the heavy wooden door of the Red Lion Tavern on a cold February evening in 1778. The first thing that hits you is the warmth from the massive fireplace, followed immediately by the aroma of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, wet wool, and whatever the tavern keeper managed to cook today. The room buzzes with conversation in multiple languages: English, German, Dutch, as travelers, locals, and refugees from other war zones gather around rough wooden tables scarred by years of hard use. Behind the bar stands widow Margaret Thompson, the tavern keeper who's managed to keep this establishment running despite losing her husband to smallpox, her eldest son to the Continental Army, and most of her reliable food suppliers to the chaos of war. Like many colonial tavern keepers, she's a woman forced into business by circumstances, and she's discovered that feeding people during a revolution requires skills that would challenge a military quartermaster. Margaret faces the daily challenge that's driving tavern keepers throughout the colonies to desperation. How do you serve hot, filling meals to hungry customers when you can't predict what ingredients will be available from one day to the next? The answer involves creativity, flexibility, and a willingness to serve foods that would have been unthinkable in peacetime taverns. Tonight's menu, scrawled on a slate board behind the bar, reflects wartime realities: hasty pudding with molasses, if available, salt pork and beans, cornbread, small beer. The parenthetical note about molasses tells the whole story. Even tavern keepers who can afford to pay premium prices can't guarantee their customers basic sweeteners. Yesterday, the molasses was available. Today, it's not. Tomorrow, it might reappear at twice the price. The hasty pudding, cornmeal boiled in water or milk until it reaches the consistency of thick porridge, has become the backbone of tavern cuisine, not because it's delicious, but because it's filling, cheap, and can be prepared in large quantities with minimal ingredients. Margaret keeps a massive pot of it simmering constantly over the fire, adding water when it gets too thick, cornmeal when supplies allow, and whatever scraps of meat or vegetables might improve the flavor. Your bowl of hasty pudding arrives steaming hot, a grayish-yellow mound that jiggles like oversized custard. The texture falls somewhere between porridge and wet cement, but it's hot, it fills your stomach, and at 3 pence a bowl, it's affordable even for travelers whose purses have been emptied by inflated food prices. You eat it with a wooden spoon while listening to the conversations around you, understanding that this simple meal represents a minor miracle of wartime logistics. At the table next to you, 3 men in Continental Army uniforms are quietly discussing troop movements and supply problems while sharing a single plate of salt pork and beans. Their conversation, conducted in low voices but audible to anyone paying attention, reveals more about military conditions than any official reports. They're debating whether to desert and go home to plant spring crops, weighing patriotic duty against family starvation in terms that make the personal cost of revolution painfully clear. Across the room, a group of local farmers argues about grain prices and military requisitions while nursing mugs of small beer that they're making last all evening. Beer costs money they can barely afford, but it's safer than water and provides both nutrition and the social lubrication needed for sharing sensitive information about hidden food stores and British troop movements. The tavern's role as an information hub becomes clear as conversations weave together military intelligence, economic updates, and personal survival strategies. Margaret moves between tables, refilling mugs, and collecting bits of information that she'll trade with other travelers and locals. Tavern keepers become unofficial intelligence networks, tracking which roads are safe, which areas have food available, and which military units are moving through the region. Women travelers, rare but not unknown, receive special attention from Margaret, who understands the additional dangers faced by women moving through war zones. She provides not just meals and lodging, but advice about safe routes, reliable contacts, and which areas to avoid. The informal network of women tavern keepers creates a communication system that helps other women navigate wartime travel. Political discussions happen openly here in ways that would be dangerous in more public settings. The tavern's quasi-private nature allows for conversations about strategy, criticism of military leadership, and debates about war goals that couldn't occur in town squares or churches. Margaret has learned to encourage political discussion while discouraging the kind of heated arguments that might escalate into violence and damage her establishment. The economic challenges of running a tavern during wartime would destroy most businesses, but Margaret has adapted through creative pricing, flexible menus, and careful customer management. She accepts payment in continental currency, but prefers hard money or barter arrangements. A traveler might pay for his meal with a day's labor in her garden or trade information about road conditions for a bowl of hasty pudding. Her food preparation methods have simplified dramatically from peacetime tavern cooking. Complex dishes that required multiple ingredients and elaborate preparation have been replaced by one-pot meals that can be prepared quickly with whatever supplies are available. Speed becomes crucial as hungry travelers arrive unexpectedly and demand immediate service, regardless of what's actually available in the kitchen. The tavern's serving schedule adapts to wartime conditions rather than traditional meal times. Food is available whenever customers arrive, and Margaret has something to serve, which might be noon one day and evening the next. Military units traveling at night receive meals at midnight. Refugees fleeing advancing armies get fed whenever they arrive, exhausted and desperate. Children help with tavern operations in ways that would shock peacetime sensibilities, but war has accelerated everyone's transition to adult responsibilities. Margaret's 12-year-old daughter tends the fire, serves beer, and collects intelligence from travelers while appearing to simply clean tables. The daughter has learned to identify military uniforms, recognize accents that indicate geographic origins, and remember conversations that might contain valuable information. The tavern's atmosphere reflects the broader social changes that war has brought to colonial society. Traditional hierarchies break down when everyone faces similar survival challenges. Well-dressed merchants sit alongside ragged farmers, discussing shared problems with food procurement and military harassment. Social distinctions that once seemed important become irrelevant when everyone is eating the same hasty pudding and sharing the same fears about the future. Religious and ethnic differences also become less important in tavern settings where survival trumps cultural preferences. German immigrants share tables with English colonists. Catholics and Protestants argue politics rather than theology. Regional accents from different colonies blend together as displaced people from various areas gather around the same fires. But underneath the democratic atmosphere lies a constant tension about loyalty and trust. Is that quiet stranger in the corner gathering intelligence for the British? Are those farmers actually loyalist sympathizers who might report military conversations to enemy forces? Margaret has learned to read people quickly, identifying potential troublemakers and managing conversations to prevent dangerous disclosures. The tavern represents a small island of relative abundance in a sea of wartime scarcity. But it's an island that could disappear at any moment if supply lines collapse completely or if armies decide to requisition the building for military purposes. Tonight, people are fed, informed, and warmed. Tomorrow, who knows? The revolution continues, one bowl of hasty pudding at a time. 13. Wild foods and foraging when the pantry runs empty. But what happens when even the taverns run out of hasty pudding? When Margaret Thompson's last pot of cornmeal has been scraped clean and there's nothing left to serve except apologies and empty bowls. That's when you learn that the real difference between survival and starvation isn't what you can buy or grow. It's what you can find, catch, kill, and gather from a landscape that's hiding food everywhere if you know where to look and aren't too proud to eat like your ancestors did before civilization made you soft. Welcome to the most humbling education in American history. Learning to feed yourself from the wild world around you when everything that represents civilized eating has disappeared into the maw of war. You're about to discover that the woods, streams, and fields you've walked past your entire life contain more food than your pantry ever held. Assuming you could develop the skills to find it, the knowledge to identify it, and the stomach to consume things that would have horrified you just months ago. Your first lesson comes from your Native American neighbors, who watch with a mixture of amusement and pity as colonial families struggle to locate food sources that have been sustaining indigenous communities for thousands of years. They understand something that you're learning the hard way. The landscape is an empty wilderness requiring human cultivation to become productive. It's a vast, complex food system that provides abundant nutrition for people who know how to work with it rather than against it. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, represent only the beginning of Native American agricultural knowledge that becomes essential for colonial survival. Wild rice grows in marshy areas where you can harvest enough grain to feed a family for weeks. Jerusalem artichokes provide starchy tubers that can be dug, stored, and prepared like potatoes. Wild onions and garlic add crucial vitamins and flavoring to otherwise monotonous diets. But gathering wild plants requires knowledge that could literally mean the difference between a nutritious meal and a painful death. Wild mushrooms provide excellent protein and flavor, but mistaking an edible variety for a poisonous one will kill you within days. Wild berries offer essential vitamins and natural sugars, but some species contain compounds that cause severe illness. You learn to identify safe plants through careful observation, consultation with knowledgeable neighbors, and small test portions that won't kill you if you've made a mistake. Pokeweed becomes one of your most important wild vegetables, but only the young shoots are safe to eat. Mature pokeweed contains toxins that can cause serious poisoning. You learn to harvest poke shoots in early spring when they're tender and safe, boiling them thoroughly to remove any remaining harmful compounds. Prepared correctly, pokeweed provides nutrition that rivals domesticated vegetables. Prepared incorrectly, it sends you to an early grave. Wild greens become crucial sources of vitamins during late winter and early spring when preserved foods are running low and fresh vegetables aren't yet available from gardens. Dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, wild spinach, and various other plants provide nutrition that prevents scurvy and other deficiency diseases. But timing is essential. Many wild greens become bitter and tough as they mature, requiring harvest during brief windows when they're young and tender. Nuts represent one of your most reliable wild food sources, providing fats and proteins that are essential for survival during lean periods. Black walnuts, hickory nuts, butternuts, and hazelnuts can be gathered in autumn and stored for winter consumption. But nut processing requires significant labor and specialized knowledge about storage methods that prevent spoilage and insect infestation. Chestnuts, before the blight that will eventually eliminate them, provide abundant starchy nutrition that can substitute for grain in many recipes. A single mature chestnut tree produces enough nuts to feed a family for weeks, but the nuts require proper drying and storage to remain edible through winter. You learn to process chestnuts into flour that can be used for bread making when wheat becomes unavailable. Acorns offer another abundant nut source, but they require extensive processing to remove bitter tannins that make them inedible in their natural state. The process involves shelling, grinding, and repeated leaching in water until the bitter compounds wash away. Properly processed acorn meal provides nutritious flour that can extend grain supplies or replace them entirely when necessary. Hunting becomes essential rather than recreational as domestic livestock disappears into military requisitions and market prices soar beyond affordability. White-tailed deer provide the largest and most valuable game animals, but hunting them requires skills, equipment, and timing that many colonial families lack. Successful deer hunting means fresh meat for immediate consumption plus enough material for smoking and preservation to last weeks. Wild turkeys, abundant in colonial forests, offer substantial protein sources for families skilled enough to hunt them successfully. These aren't the domesticated turkeys of modern farms. Wild turkeys are fast, clever, and difficult to approach. They provide 20 to 30 pounds of meat when successfully hunted, representing significant nutritional resources for families facing food shortages. Small game becomes more reliable than large animals for most families lacking specialized hunting skills. Rabbits, squirrels, and various birds can be trapped or hunted with simpler equipment and less expertise than deer or turkey hunting requires. A successful squirrel hunt might provide only enough meat for one meal, but squirrels are numerous and can be caught regularly with patience and basic trapping knowledge. Fishing provides protein sources that don't require the tracking and shooting skills necessary for hunting land animals. Rivers and streams contain trout, bass, and other freshwater fish that can be caught with simple equipment and basic techniques. Coastal areas offer additional opportunities for catching saltwater fish, gathering shellfish, and collecting seaweed that provides essential nutrients. Shellfish gathering becomes particularly important for coastal communities facing severe food shortages. Clams, oysters, and mussels can be collected during low tide without specialized equipment or advanced skills. These mollusks provide high-quality protein and can be consumed fresh or preserved for later use. But shellfish gathering requires knowledge about safe collection areas and proper preparation methods to avoid poisoning. Seasonal timing becomes crucial for successful wild food procurement. Spring offers wild greens, early berries, and fish runs that provide abundant nutrition after winter scarcity. Summer brings berries, early nuts, and the peak abundance of wild plants. Autumn represents the most important foraging season, with nuts, late berries, and the final opportunities to gather food for winter storage. Wild berries provide essential vitamins and natural sweeteners during summer months when fresh fruit becomes unavailable through normal trade channels. Blackberries, raspberries, elderberries, and wild strawberries can be eaten fresh or preserved for winter consumption. But berry gathering requires knowledge about optimal picking times and competition with wildlife that depends on the same food sources. Root vegetables grow wild in various habitats, providing starchy nutrition that can substitute for cultivated potatoes and turnips. Wild onions, garlic, and various tubers can be dug from forest floors and meadows. But root identification requires expertise to avoid poisonous varieties that can cause severe illness or death. Medicinal plants become increasingly important as conventional medical care becomes unavailable and nutritional deficiencies create health problems. Sassafras provides pain relief and flavoring. Willow bark contains compounds similar to aspirin. Various herbs can treat digestive problems, infections, and other ailments common during periods of poor nutrition and stress. The psychological adjustment to eating wild foods challenges colonial families who've spent generations relying on cultivated crops and domestic livestock. Foods that were once considered fit only for Native Americans or desperately poor people become essential nutrition for families who previously enjoyed comfortable middle-class diets. The humbling process of learning to eat from the wild landscape forces reconsideration of what constitutes acceptable food and proper social status. Children adapt more quickly than adults to wild food diets, approaching unusual foods with curiosity rather than prejudice. Kids learn to gather berries, identify edible plants, and process nuts with enthusiasm that helps family survival efforts. Their flexible attitudes toward food become valuable family assets during periods when adult food preferences become unaffordable luxuries. But wild food procurement requires time and energy that compete with other survival activities. Hours spent hunting or gathering are hours not available for farming, paid labor, or other essential tasks. Families must balance wild food gathering against other survival priorities, often making difficult decisions about how to allocate limited time and energy. The skills you're learning now, which plants are safe, which animals are huntable, where to find food when civilization collapses will serve you well. Because the war isn't finished teaching you what real hunger means. 14. The first American cookbook, Amelia Simmons' Revolution. But here's the beautiful irony of survival. All those desperate innovations you've been forced to master. The acorn coffee, the cornmeal substitutions, the wild plant cookery that kept your family alive when civilization collapsed around your dinner table. These aren't just temporary wartime expedients. You've been accidentally creating a new cuisine, a distinctly American way of cooking that's about to be documented by a woman who understands hunger, hardship, and the kind of resourceful cooking that emerges when you have to feed people with whatever you can find. Meet Amelia Simmons, and she's about to change everything you think you know about American food by writing it all down for the first time. In 1796, 20 years after you started drinking chicory coffee and eating Johnny cakes to survive British blockades, this remarkable woman publishes American Cookery, the first cookbook written by an American for Americans, using American ingredients and American techniques that emerge from the crucible of war and scarcity. Amelia describes herself simply as an American orphan, but that humble phrase contains the entire story of how war, displacement, and survival created a new kind of cook. She's not writing from the privileged kitchen of a wealthy plantation or the comfort of a European-trained culinary education. She's writing from the experience of someone who learned to cook the way you learned to cook, by making do, by substituting, by taking whatever ingredients were available and transforming them into something edible through sheer necessity and stubborn determination. Her cookbook reads like a manual for the kind of survival cooking you've been practicing for the past 8 years. The recipes reflect not the elaborate European cuisine that wealthy colonists try to recreate, but the practical, innovative food culture that emerged when people had to eat American ingredients using techniques that worked in American kitchens with American fuel and American cooking equipment. Take her recipe for Indian pudding, the first published recipe for what becomes a distinctly American dessert. This isn't some exotic creation designed to showcase expensive imported ingredients. It's cornmeal scalded with milk, sweetened with molasses, and baked slowly for hours. Sound familiar? It should, because it's essentially the same hasty pudding you've been eating for years, dressed up with proper technique and dignified with a name that acknowledges its Native American origins. Cornmeal appears throughout Amelia's cookbook in ways that would have been unthinkable in European cooking, but have become essential to American survival. Johnny cake, Indian slapjacks, and various corn-based breads reflect the reality that corn isn't just a substitute for wheat. It's become the foundation of American cooking. The techniques for working with corn that you learned during grain shortages have evolved into cooking methods that produce foods with their own distinct textures, flavors, and cultural significance. Her innovations with leavening agents reveal how wartime scarcity forced American cooks to develop new techniques that actually improve their cooking. Pearl ash, a refined form of potash made from wood ash, provides the chemical leavening that makes American baking different from European traditions. While European bakers relied on yeast or beaten eggs for light textures, American cooks learned to use alkali from burned wood to create the chemical reactions that make cakes rise and cookies spread properly. The use of pearl ash wasn't just a clever substitution. It represented a fundamental advance in baking chemistry that gave American cooks capabilities their European counterparts lacked. Cookies, as Americans came to know them, couldn't be made reliably without chemical leavening. The quick breads that became American specialties required alkali to react with acidic ingredients and create the light textures that made corn-based batters palatable. Amelia's recipes for cookies, she's the first person to use that word in print, show how Dutch influences combined with American ingredients and techniques to create something entirely new. Her cookie recipes use the chemical leavening that American cooks had mastered, shaped with techniques borrowed from Dutch immigrants, flavored with whatever spices were available during war shortages, and sweetened with whatever alternatives to sugar colonial cooks had learned to use. The cookbook's treatment of meat reflects the realities of American hunting and livestock management that you've lived through. Her recipes assume that cooks might have venison, wild turkey, or other game animals that wouldn't appear in European cookbooks. The preservation techniques she describes, smoking, salting, and drying, represent the methods you developed when refrigeration was impossible and proper preservation meant the difference between eating and starving. Her vegetable recipes incorporate the wild plants and unusual varieties that became essential during food shortages. Pumpkins, squash, and other Native American crops receive detailed treatment that reflects their importance in American cuisine. The techniques for preparing these vegetables acknowledge that American cooks were working with plants their European ancestors never encountered, using methods developed through trial and error rather than inherited tradition. The cookbook's beverage section reveals how completely American drinking habits had diverged from European patterns. Her recipes for spruce beer and other fermented drinks made from local plants reflect the innovations you developed when imported beer became unavailable. The techniques for making alcoholic beverages from corn, molasses, and wild plants represent survival skills that became permanent features of American food culture. Cranberry sauce makes its first recorded appearance in American cuisine through Amelia's cookbook, documenting how Native American ingredients were being incorporated into dishes that served traditional European functions but used distinctly American flavors. Her cranberry recipes reflect the kind of creative adaptation that characterized wartime cooking, taking an unfamiliar ingredient and finding ways to make it work in familiar food contexts. The cookbook's tone reflects the democratic spirit that emerged from shared wartime hardships. Amelia doesn't write for trained professional cooks or wealthy housekeepers with elaborate kitchen staffs. She writes for ordinary American women who do their own cooking, manage their own food preservation, and need practical advice about working with whatever ingredients they can afford or obtain. Her measurements and techniques assume the kind of improvisation that became second nature during war shortages. A handful of this, enough to make a stiff batter, bake until done. These aren't precise measurements by European standards, but they're perfectly adequate instruction for cooks who learn to work by feel, taste, and experience rather than rigid adherence to formal recipes. The cookbook represents something unprecedented in food literature. Recipes developed by and for people who learn to cook under conditions of scarcity, uncertainty, and constant adaptation. Every technique Amelia describes emerged from the practical necessity of feeding families when normal food systems had collapsed. Every ingredient substitution reflects innovations developed when preferred items became unavailable or unaffordable. Her writing acknowledges the political dimensions of American cooking without making them explicit. The emphasis on domestic ingredients, local techniques, and independence from European imports reflects the broader cultural project of creating American identity through everyday practices. Food becomes a way of expressing national independence at the most basic level of daily survival. The cookbook's success reveals how ready Americans were to embrace their own food culture rather than continuing to aspire to European standards they could no longer afford or obtain. Amelia's recipes provide validation that the survival cooking you developed during wartime wasn't primitive or embarrassing. It was innovative, practical, and worthy of documentation and preservation. But the cookbook also marks the end of an era. By 1796, the desperate improvisations of wartime have been codified into established American traditions. The techniques you developed to survive British blockades have become normal American cooking methods. The substitutions you made from necessity have become choices that define American cuisine. You've helped create a new food culture without even realizing it. And Amelia Simmons has written it down so no one will forget how American cooking was born from American hunger. The revolution is over. American food culture has begun. 15. Victory and its bitter taste. War's end and food recovery. October 19th, 1781. The cannons fall silent at Yorktown. The British surrender. And church bells ring across the 13 colonies announcing that you've won your independence. You'd think this would be the moment when your food troubles end, when normal eating returns, when you can finally stop drinking chicory coffee and start planning meals that don't require foraging in the woods. You'd be wrong, because winning a war, it turns out, is much easier than rebuilding a food system that's been shattered by 8 years of armies eating everything in sight. Welcome to victory, American style, where political independence doesn't automatically translate to food security, and where you're about to discover that some of the changes forced on you by war have become permanent features of your new nation's identity. The techniques you learned to survive British blockades aren't going away just because the British have gone home. The cornmeal recipes you developed aren't temporary expedients anymore. They're American cuisine. Your first hint that victory tastes different than you expected comes when you realize that the end of fighting doesn't immediately restore the food systems that sustained you before 1775. The Caribbean trade routes that brought sugar and molasses, they need to be rebuilt from scratch with new treaties, new trading relationships, and new sources of credit that don't depend on British merchants. Those European import networks that supplied wine, tea, and luxury foods, they're viewing the new United States with skepticism, uncertain whether American merchants can pay their debts or maintain stable trade relationships. Local food production faces even more immediate challenges. 8 years of armies marching through farmland have left fields damaged, fences destroyed, and soil depleted by military camps that house thousands of soldiers in areas designed to support much smaller populations. Your neighbor's farm, requisitioned by Continental forces in 1778 and used as a military supply depot, now resembles a moonscape of rutted earth and scattered debris. It will take years to restore that land to productive agriculture. Livestock populations have been decimated by military consumption on both sides. The cattle, pigs, and chickens that formed the backbone of colonial protein production were eaten by hungry armies who couldn't wait for sustainable farming practices. Rebuilding herds requires time, capital, and breeding stock that often no longer exists in many regions. Your community's carefully developed bloodlines of productive animals have been scattered to the winds or converted into army rations. The human cost becomes equally apparent as you look around your community and count who didn't survive the war years. Not just the men who died in battle, but the women who died in childbirth weakened by malnutrition, the children who succumbed to diseases that well-fed bodies might have fought off, the elderly who simply couldn't survive on wartime diets that lacked essential nutrition. Every family has lost someone to hunger, disease, or the cascading health effects of years of inadequate food. But here's what surprises you. Many of the wartime adaptations you made aren't disappearing now that better options are theoretically available. Your family has grown to prefer cornbread to wheat bread, not because you have to eat it, but because you've learned to make it well and it tastes like home. Your children, who grew up drinking chicory coffee, find imported coffee too bitter and unfamiliar. The wild greens you gather during food shortages have become regular additions to your diet because they're nutritious, free, and available. The psychological changes run deeper than food preferences. You've learned to view abundance with suspicion, to hoard supplies against future shortages, and to waste nothing that might be edible later. The casual attitude toward food that characterized pre-war colonial life has been replaced by a hard-earned appreciation for every calorie. You save scraps that you would have thrown away 8 years ago. You preserve food more carefully and in greater quantities than objective necessity requires. You've become permanently shaped by the experience of real hunger. Economic recovery proves frustratingly slow as the new nation struggles with massive war debts, worthless continental currency, and the challenge of establishing credit relationships with foreign suppliers. The phrase, "not worth a continental," continues to haunt American commerce as merchants and farmers struggle to conduct business with money that many people still refuse to accept. Food prices remain volatile as markets try to establish new equilibrium points between damaged supply systems and populations that spent years learning to live with less. Regional food cultures that began diverging during the war continue developing along separate paths. New England's economy increasingly focuses on maritime trade and manufacturing, creating urban populations that depend on purchased food rather than agricultural self-sufficiency. The Middle Colony's agricultural abundance allows for more diverse diets, and continued development of the mixed farming that made them the Revolution's breadbasket. The South begins its deeper commitment to cash crop agriculture that will shape its food culture for generations. The social implications of shared wartime hunger begin reshaping American society in unexpected ways. Class distinctions that once seemed natural and permanent have been blurred by the experience of universal food insecurity. Wealthy families who ate the same cornmeal mush as their servants during British blockades find it harder to maintain previous hierarchies. The knowledge that anyone's food security can collapse overnight creates a more egalitarian attitude toward basic survival needs. Women's roles in food production and management have expanded permanently due to wartime necessities that required them to master skills previously considered men's work. Women learned to hunt, to manage livestock, to make business decisions about food procurement, and to organize community responses to food crises. These expanded capabilities don't disappear when peace returns, creating subtle but significant shifts in domestic power relationships. Technological innovations developed during wartime become permanent improvements to American food production. The chemical leavening techniques that emerge from using wood ash in baking provide American cooks with capabilities that give them advantages over European traditions. Improved preservation methods developed through necessity create food storage systems that are more efficient and reliable than pre-war techniques. Trade relationships within the new nation begin developing along patterns established during wartime resource sharing. Communities that helped each other survive British blockades maintain commercial connections that create regional food networks. The mutual aid that kept families alive during the worst shortages evolves into business relationships that help establish American internal commerce. Children who grew up during the war carry forward attitudes toward food that will influence American culture for generations. They understand scarcity, waste nothing, and view food abundance as something that should never be taken for granted. But they also understand innovation, adaptation, and the possibility of creating good meals from whatever ingredients are available. Their flexibility and resourcefulness become defining characteristics of American food culture. The political implications of food security become embedded in American governance as leaders who experienced wartime hunger design policies intended to prevent future food crises. The importance of maintaining domestic food production, controlling food prices during emergencies, and ensuring that military forces can be fed without destroying civilian food systems become permanent considerations in American policy planning. Religious and cultural attitudes toward food shift as wartime experiences challenge traditional ideas about providence, prosperity, and divine favor. The randomness of who starved and who survived during the war years complicates simple explanations about virtue being rewarded with abundance. Food becomes more closely associated with human effort and mutual aid rather than divine blessing or social status. International perceptions of American food culture begin forming as foreign visitors encounter the unique combination of ingredients, techniques, and attitudes that emerge from revolutionary experience. European travelers often comment on Americans' preference for corn-based foods, their casual mixing of ethnic cooking traditions, and their practical approach to nutrition over elaborate presentation. Your daily meals now reflect this complex inheritance from 8 years of food-focused survival. Breakfast might include cornbread made with technique perfected during flour shortages, coffee mixed with chicory because you've learned to prefer the flavor, and bacon from pigs whose bloodlines survived military consumption through careful hiding and community cooperation. Each bite carries the memory of harder times and the satisfaction of having endured them successfully. The victory you've won isn't just political independence for Britain. You've also won a new relationship with food that emphasizes self-reliance, innovation, and the kind of resourcefulness that emerges when survival depends on your ability to eat whatever you can find, grow, hunt, or create from available ingredients. American food culture, born from American hunger, seasoned with American stubbornness, and preserved through American determination, has survived its founding crisis. Now it's ready to feed a nation.